Today General Hospital will reveal Anna Devane had stepped into the case with the precision and discipline of a woman who had lived her life surrounded by shadows, betrayal, and half-truths. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the tangled web of resentment that surrounded Drew Kane. He had, in the span of months, become one of the most despised men in Port Charles. He had blackmailed Sonny Corinthos, interfered with Michael's custody battle, alienated Alexis Davis by cutting her off from Scout, undermined Stella Henry's career, and manipulated Willow Tate in a way that left wounds far deeper than scandal. Each person he crossed became another potential suspect, another face on Anna's ever-growing board of motives, needs, and opportunities. But this was not a simple case of narrowing down suspects. It was a labyrinth where every corridor seemed to end in another dead end. From the beginning, Anna threw herself into the investigation with her trademark intensity. She analyzed the crime scene with forensic precision, studied inconsistencies in alibis, and listened not just to the words people said but the silences between them. Carly Spencer's defensiveness, Portia Robinson's simmering resentment, Alexis's righteous fury, and even Willow's quiet desperation all painted a portrait of Drew as a man whose enemies were legion. Still, for all her years of experience, something about this case felt off to Anna. Every theory she considered dissolved under scrutiny, as if the truth itself was deliberately hiding behind a veil she could not pierce. That veil began to lift the night Anna followed her instincts to the Quartermain estate. She had already been troubled by Michael's vague statements about his whereabouts, the curious gap between the time Drew was shot and when Michael was seen again. A stray detail, a splash of mud on an expensive carpet, too fresh to match Michael's alibi, set her suspicions racing. The discovery of a rain-soaked coat in the Quartermain garage, its fibers tainted with gunpowder residue, narrowed her focus. The final confirmation came when she quietly obtained a glove left behind in haste, tucked into a corner where someone in panic might have thought it would never be found. The analysis was devastatingly clear. The glove matched residue patterns from the gun that had nearly killed Drew. Michael Corinthos was the shooter. The realization nearly brought Anna to her knees. She had faced countless criminals, terrorists, and assassins in her career, but Michael was not one of them, at least not in the way she defined evil. He was a man born into power and burdened with loyalty, someone who had fought, suffered, and loved with the same ferocity that had carried his family through decades of violence and betrayal. But Drew had pushed him too far. Drew had not just threatened Michael's stability, he had tampered with the one thing Michael valued above all else: his family. Drew's intrusion into Willow's life, his manipulative hold over the children, had ignited a rage Michael could no longer contain. It had not been premeditated cruelty, it had been an eruption of fury, or reckless choice in a moment that changed everything. Anna stood at a crossroads. On one side lay duty, her oath as an officer of the law, her lifelong pursuit of justice. On the other side lay compassion, the very human instinct to protect rather than destroy. If she exposed Michael, the fallout would be catastrophic. The Corinthos and Quartermain families would implode under the scandal, Port Charles itself would fracture as allies turned into enemies, and Michael would spend the rest of his life behind bars branded as a murderer. If she kept the secret, the investigation would stall, and the case would spiral into confusion, a mystery forever unsolved. Justice for Drew would be denied, yet Anna could not ignore that Drew himself had carved the path to this tragedy through his own betrayals. For Anna, the decision was both an act of defiance and surrender. She chose to bury the evidence. With hands steadier than she felt inside, she rewrote the narrative of the case, steering suspicion toward other suspects, misdirecting Dandy's questions, and locking away the damning proof in a hidden file she swore never to reveal. To the world, the case became an insolvable puzzle, tangled in red herrings and false leads. To Anna, it became a secret so heavy it threatened to crush her every time she looked Michael in the eye. And yet, she told herself, she had done what was necessary. Michael was not a monster. He was a son, a father, a man whose life had already been shaped by too much loss. She believed she had saved him from a fate he did not deserve, even if it meant sacrificing her own integrity. But beneath that justification simmered an unshakable fear that one day, someone, Dante, Sonny, or even Willow, would stumble upon the truth. And when that day came, it would not just destroy Michael, it would destroy her too. Anna had crossed a line that she knew she could never uncross. In choosing to shield Michael, she had not simply bent the rules, she had shattered them. She rewrote the official record of the investigation with meticulous care, manipulating details so subtly that even Dante, with his relentless pursuit of truth, could not immediately detect the inconsistencies. Every report that left her desk had been filtered, polished, and angled to support a narrative that would divert suspicion away from Michael. Witness statements were rearranged, timelines slightly adjusted, and forensic evidence reframed so that the trail led nowhere. The gunpowder residue she had found was quietly omitted, the glove destroyed, and the mud stains on the quartermain carpet explained away as irrelevant. Piece by piece, she built a facade strong enough to convince the entire department that the case was spiraling into the insolvable. She redirected Dante and the PCPD toward alternative suspects, each more plausible on the surface than the last. Carly's heated arguments with Drew in the days before the shooting were given greater weight in the reports. Portia's late-night movements were cast in a suspicious light. Alexis's history of volatile decisions was magnified until it seemed she could have snapped under the pressure of losing access to Scout. Even Willow's collapse and erratic behavior were subtly woven into the investigative fabric, suggesting emotional instability that might have boiled over. To an outsider, the investigation appeared thorough. In reality, Anna had constructed a labyrinth, one that looped endlessly through dead ends designed to ensure no one could ever stumble upon the truth she alone carried. As weeks passed, the cracks in her conscience widened. She could feel them late at night, when the silence of her home pressed too heavily on her shoulders. By day she wore the mask of composure, commanding respect as the unwavering agent who had faced down international criminals and lived to tell the tale. But behind closed doors, she felt the weight of her decision gnaw at her with merciless persistence. Every time she locked eyes with Dante, she felt the sting of betrayal. He trusted her implicitly, leaned on her instincts, and believed in her integrity, yet she was lying to him with every breath. She had stolen his chance to uncover the truth, to do the job he was sworn to do, and she could see the frustration building in him as the case stubbornly refused to break open. The chaos in Port Charles intensified with each passing day. Old grudges deepened as former allies turned on each other under the cloud of suspicion. Those who had despised Drew in life now fumed at the thought that his shooter walked free, protected by a justice system they increasingly saw as compromised. The Quartermains whispered about conspiracies. The Corinthos family bristled under the constant pressure of being scrutinized, and at General Hospital, the staff found themselves caught in the crossfire of speculation and anger. Rumors spread like wildfire, feeding paranoia and mistrust. The case had stopped being about Drew alone and had become a symbol of a town tearing itself apart under the weight of too many secrets. Anna told herself repeatedly that she had chosen the lesser of two evils. Exposing Michael would not only destroy him, but ignite a chain reaction of vengeance and collapse. Sonny would stop at nothing to protect his son, even if it meant igniting a war with the PCPD. Carly would burn every bridge, even those that had once sheltered her. Willow would shatter under the revelation that her husband had spilled blood in her name, and the fragile balance of power in Port Charles would crumble. In her mind, sparing Michael was sparing them all from a far greater calamity. Yet deep down, Anna knew the truth was not so simple. What she had done was not preservation, it was suppression, and suppression always came with a price. Every time she walked into her office, she imagined the day someone else would stumble upon the file she had buried, or worse, notice the trail she had tried so carefully to cover. She feared the moment Dante would realize the patterns in her reports did not align, or when Sonny's keen instincts would catch the subtle changes in her tone when Michael's name came up. She dreaded the possibility that Michael himself, tormented by guilt, might confess in a moment of weakness. Each of these scenarios haunted her like shadows lurking in the corners of her vision. Anna had once built her reputation on being incorruptible, a woman who pursued truth even when it cost her everything. Now she lived with the knowledge that she had compromised the very foundation of who she was. Protecting Michael had become both her greatest act of mercy and her gravest sin. She told herself that as long as the secret remained safe, Port Charles was safe. But even she knew that no secret stayed buried forever. One day, the truth would claw its way back into the light, and when it did, it would not only destroy Michael, it would destroy her, and with her, the fragile peace she had fought so desperately to protect. In the shadows of the concealed truth, Drew lay suspended between life and death, his body fragile beneath the sterile lights of the operating room. While his loved ones unraveled in the waiting halls, surgeons fought desperately to extract the bullets lodged dangerously close to his spine, every second threatening to tip the balance between survival and finality. The atmosphere inside General Hospital was suffocating, each hallway echoing with fear and uncertainty. Tracy, Carly, and others lingered anxiously, their expressions carved with worry, none of them realizing that the very answers they sought were hidden in plain sight. Michael, outwardly calm, stood among them as if sharing their grief, his face a mask concealing the storm beneath. Only Anna carried the weight of knowing the truth, and the burden pressed heavier with each passing hour. Dante threw himself into the manhunt with tireless determination, convinced that the perpetrator was within his reach. He followed leads with a near-obsessive focus, interviewing witnesses, revisiting the crime scene, and dissecting every alibi. The conviction in his voice inspired his team, yet beneath that drive was a haunting sense of frustration. The puzzle seemed insolvable, always circling back to contradictions that made no sense. He did not know that Anna herself had laid those contradictions in his path. He told himself he was one step away from the killer, and aware that the step he needed to take would lead him to his own brother. Willow, caught in a whirlpool of emotions, felt her world collapsing inward. Drew's fate gnawed at her. The man who had stood by her, complicated as their relationship was, might not live to see another sunrise. But more than Drew's condition, it was the invisible thread tugging at her heart that disturbed her most. She had seen the darkness in Michael's eyes on nights when tension ran too high, had felt the way his protective love edged into something fierce, something dangerous. She wanted to dismiss the possibility that Michael could have been involved, but a quiet instinct whispered otherwise. And that instinct, once planted, refused to be silenced. She struggled with the unthinkable. Was she complicit in Drew's suffering simply by being the reason Michael acted? The guilt threatened to suffocate her, twisting every tender moment with Michael into a reminder of the blood he might have spilled for her sake. Sonny, still blinded by his vendetta against Drew, remained oblivious to the storm raging in his own family. He raged quietly at the thought that someone else had struck first, stealing from him the opportunity to settle his score on his own terms. His focus on Drew's downfall left him blind to the possibility that Michael had crossed a line even Sonny had not dared to cross. For years Sonny had protected Michael, built walls of loyalty and power around him, convinced himself that his son could remain untouched by the darker parts of their legacy. He had no idea that Michael had already stepped into that darkness, not for business, not for power, but for love twisted into desperation. The irony was brutal. Sonny, the eternal protector, had failed to protect his son from himself. At the heart of it all was Anna, carrying the unbearable secret like a lead weight chained to her soul. She moved through each day with practiced composure, her words steady, her commands decisive, her presence unshaken. To the world she was still the unyielding force of justice, the woman who had never flinched in the face of impossible odds. But inside, she was collapsing. Every glance at Michael threatened to expose her, every question from Dante pierced her resolve, every moment near Sonny or Carly reminded her of the bond she held in her hands. She knew with chilling certainty that if this truth ever surfaced, it would not simply wound, it would obliterate everything in its path. Port Charles was a city held together by fragile threads of alliances, grudges, and histories. If Michael was revealed as Drew's shooter, those threads would snap in unison, sending shockwaves through every family, every business, every bond that had been precariously maintained. And when that truth came, Dante would be the first to stand in the blast. The revelation that his half-brother was the culprit would tear him apart. His badge, his oath, his integrity all demanded that he act, but his blood, his heart, his sense of loyalty to family screamed for mercy. He would be pulled into directions with equal force, knowing that whichever choice he made would destroy him. To expose Michael would mean betraying his family, to protect him would mean betraying the law. Either way, he would lose a part of himself that could never be reclaimed. Anna foresaw this spiral even as she clung to her decision to shield Michael. She told herself she was buying time, sparing the city from collapse, preserving Michael's future for the sake of Willow and the children. But deep down, she knew she had only delayed the inevitable. The truth was a ticking bomb, and with every beat of Drew's faltering heart on the operating table, with every anguished tear shed in the hospital corridors, with every step Dante took closer to the truth, the timer ticked down toward detonation. And when the explosion came, it would not discriminate. It would consume them all. When the truth about Michael finally surfaced, Sonny Corinthos would face the most excruciating dilemma of his life. For decades, he had been the ultimate protector, the patriarch, who shielded his children from the storms of his own making. He had fought wars, sacrificed allies, and endured personal losses, all under the conviction that his family would remain safe. But now, standing in the aftermath of the revelation that his eldest son had pulled the trigger, Sonny's world would tilt into a new kind of chaos. His paternal instinct would roar to the surface, urging him to protect Michael no matter the cost. The father in him would want to gather Michael into his arms, shield him from judgment, and make the entire world pay for forcing his son into such a dark corner. Yet the mob boss, the man who had long understood that choices carry consequences, would recognize the line Michael had crossed. Drew's shooting was not business, it was not power play. It was a deeply personal act that had spilled innocent blood. And Sonny knew that protecting Michael this time meant declaring open war against the very justice system he had managed to dance around for years. If Sonny chose to protect his son, he would immediately become the lightning rod for the wrath of Port Charles. The PCPD, already wary of his influence, would treat his actions as proof that the Corinthos family operated above the law. Dante would be forced to reckon with his father obstructing justice, a betrayal that could shatter their fragile bond forever. Old enemies like Cyrus Renaud and Valentin Casadini would exploit the chaos, twisting the scandal into opportunities to undermine Sonny's empire. Every ally Sonny had built over the years, Brick, Spinelli, even Jason, if he were still by his side, would question the wisdom of putting Michael above the stability of the organization. By choosing family, Sonny would risk the collapse of his empire, and with it, the fragile balance of power that kept Port Charles from plunging into anarchy. On the other hand, if Sonny chose silence or worse, acknowledgement, he would break the very vow that had defined him as a father. Sonny had always promised that no matter what happened, he would never abandon Michael. To hand him over, to stand back, and let the justice system consume him, would be to break that sacred bond. Sonny would carry that betrayal for the rest of his life, haunted by the look of devastation in Michael's eyes. The image of his son, alone and condemned, would carve itself into his conscience like a scar that would never heal. Sonny would remain the mob boss, respected and feared, but the father within him would be destroyed, hollowed out by a decision he could never undo. And then there was Willow, the quiet epicenter of this storm, whose life would be ripped apart in ways she had never imagined. Everything Michael had done, every secret kept, every risk taken had been in the name of protecting her and the children. For years, she had known him as the man who carried the weight of responsibility with strength and grace. But now, with blood on his hands, she would see the darker side of his devotion, a side so consuming that it blurred the lines between love and obsession. Gratitude would war with horror inside her, tearing her heart in two. She would thank him silently for standing up for her, for putting her safety above all else, but she would also recoil at the lengths he had gone to achieve it. Each night, as she lay awake beside him, Willow would find herself haunted by the same question: could she truly raise her children alongside a man who had killed in her name? She would look at Michael not just as a husband, but as a father, the man who read bedtime stories, who carried Wiley on his shoulders, who soothed Amelia when she cried. And then she would see the other Michael, the one who had pressed the trigger, who had justified taking a life as an act of love. Reconciling those two versions of him would threaten to shatter her sanity. The home she had fought so hard to build would no longer feel like a sanctuary but a fragile weight hiding a truth too monstrous to accept. Willow's inner turmoil would leave her at a breaking point. On one hand, she could cling to love, convincing herself that Michael had acted out of desperation, that he could be forgiven, that their family was worth saving no matter what. On the other hand, she could not ignore the moral chasm yawning before her. To accept Michael fully would mean accepting that she was complicit in his crime, that her very existence had been the reason for Drew's suffering. The guilt of that knowledge could poison her, eroding her spirit until she no longer recognized herself. Her struggle would become the most tragic of all, not merely the loss of trust in her husband, but the collapse of her belief in the life they had created together. And so, Sunny and Willow, bound to Michael in different but equally powerful ways, would stand on opposite ends of a devastating truth. One as a father torn between power and loyalty, the other as a wife torn between love and morality. Together, their choices would define whether Michael's sin destroyed just him or rip apart the entire fabric of Port Charles. Carly Corinthos, whose very identity had long been bound to the survival and success of her children, would unravel the moment the truth about Michael surfaced. Her instinctive response would not be reflection or remorse but immediate defense. For Carly, Michael was not merely her son, he was her redemption, her anchor, the one constant in a life defined by chaos. To accept that he had pulled the trigger would be to accept that she had failed him, and that was something Carly could never allow herself to believe. Instead, she would weaponize her grief, channel her ferocity, and twist the narrative until Michael was not the aggressor but the victim. Drew, she would insist, had forced this outcome by his reckless choices, his betrayals, his manipulations. She would argue that Michael had been cornered, that any father or husband would have done the same, and in doing so, she would begin spinning a story designed to protect Michael at any cost. But Carly would not stop there. She would seek out Anna, sensing immediately that the other woman carried the same secret. Carly had always been quick to read people, and she would see the guilt etched into Anna's posture, the hesitation in her carefully measured words. A quiet alliance would form between them, and spoken but undeniable. Anna would rationalize it as a necessity, prolonging the lie to preserve fragile peace, while Carly would treat it as a weapon, pushing for a full rewrite of the case. Evidence would be reframed, motives reassigned, and slowly the picture would shift toward other suspects. Carly's brilliance lay in her ability to convince not just herself but everyone around her that her truth was the only truth worth believing. If she needed to paint Alexis as unhinged, Portia as vengeful, or even Willow as emotionally unstable, she would do it. Carly's loyalty was absolute, but it was also blinding, and the deeper she went, the more the family she sought to protect became entangled in her web of deceit. The strain of her cover-up would not remain hidden. Dante, who had always respected Carly as the fierce matriarch of Michael's world, would begin to see through the cracks. Her insistence on defending Michael, her eagerness to dismiss leads that pointed too close to him, would begin to unsettle him. The more Carly pushed, the more Dante would feel her interference was intentional, a deliberate obstruction to shield her son. His badge demanded that he call her out, but his bloodline complicated the matter. For Sunny, the tension would cut even deeper. Carly's instinct to protect Michael mirrored his own, but her methods aggressive, manipulative, reckless would draw him into the very conflict he was desperate to avoid. Every lie Carly told, every distraction she created, would pull Sunny closer to the precipice, forcing him to question not only Michael's morality but Carly's judgment as well. Meanwhile, Anna would find herself caught in a tightening vice. She had been the one to carry the secret first, the one who had chosen to bury the evidence, but as Carly pushed harder, Anna's quiet cover-up became an active conspiracy. Her name, once synonymous with integrity and justice, would be whispered with suspicion in the corridors of the PCPD. Dante would sense her evasions, Jordan would question her leadership, and her long career built on sacrifice and principle would begin to crumble. The betrayal would cut deepest not from her enemies but from her allies, the men and women who had fought alongside her, who had trusted her to stand as the moral compass in a city often lost in shadows. If the truth were exposed, Anna would not merely lose her career, she would lose her honor, her reputation, and perhaps even the few personal connections she still valued. When the secret could no longer be contained and the truth came crashing into the open, Port Charles itself would fracture. The city would split into factions, each interpreting Michael's act through the lens of their loyalties. One camp, driven by sympathy, would argue that Michael had acted out of desperation, a man pushed too far by Drew's cruelty and betrayals. They would see him not as a murderer but as a flawed man protecting the people he loved. The other camp, however, would be unrelenting in their anger. To them, Michael's crime would confirm what they had long believed, that the Corinthos and Quartermain families lived above the law, escaping justice through influence, intimidation, and connections. Drew's shooting would become more than a personal tragedy. It would become the symbol of systemic injustice, proof that power in Port Charles was not balanced but corrupted. Alliances would crack under the pressure. Friendships would falter. Trust between families would corrode beyond repair. What had begun as a single act of violence would metastasize into a citywide conflict. Every whispered rumor would fuel a new vendetta. Every unanswered question would ignite a new conspiracy. The streets of Port Charles would become a battlefield not of bullets but of secrets, lies, and betrayals, each one more dangerous than the last. Instead of resolution, Drew's case would fester like an open wound, bleeding distrust into every corner of the city. And in the end, Michael's act would not just scar his own family, it would plunge Port Charles into a state of chaos from which it might never truly recover.